take a little bit of time and explore and try to understand a constructionist way of looking at and understanding sport deviant behavior and violence. A little bit about a constructionist thinking. First of all, is it focuses on relative experiences. Essentially, from this particular point of view, no action is inherently good or bad. It's that the definitions and the interpretations of those actions and how we see the world actually has an influence on understanding what we consider to be deviant behavior in the world of sport, and then maybe even more importantly, how we act or interact with those concepts of what is right and what's wrong. As we know, since people are complicated and sports are complicated, trying to understand sport deviant behavior or violence is going to be extremely complicated. Previous traditional or historical explanations of deviant behavior did not really provide us enough analytical power for looking at and understanding that some actions or reactions are going to be relative. A great example of a constructionist way of looking at and understanding sport deviant behavior is from the world or the lens of labeling theory. Labeling theory has a lot of antecedents, or a lot of people that have been working for many years on this idea of what constitutes the theory of labeling theory. First, if we even go back to the 1920s and the 1930s, you had three individuals that were really influential in putting together or sowing the seeds for the foundation of labeling theory. Frank Tannenbaum in the late 1930s started talking about and really theorizing and trying to look at and understand how labeling someone as deviant or bad actually aids them in becoming the very thing that he is described as being. And so this is kind of the idea of the self-fulfilling prophecy, a very important idea or concept for this theory. Charles Horton Cooley in the late 1920s and the early 1930s talked about the looking glass self. And the idea here is that you just try to put yourself in a space where you could look at how people view you and your behaviors from their point of view. Kind of like if you think about, you sort of floated up outside your body and you're able to see how other people were viewing and interacting with you. And then George Herbert Mead talked about the generalized other. Essentially, from this point of view, he was saying that society's view of who we are and the behaviors that we have are going to be influential on us. Behavior is neither good or bad. The action is simply defined as deviant or violent by those people that are in charge. Becker talked about or named these people the rule enforcers. And this is going to be very important when we start thinking about breaking rules. Now, whether they're laws or not, remember, we're not talking about laws. We're talking about acts of deviant behavior. Okay? Edward Limmer in the early 1950s made the distinction between primary and secondary deviance. He said primary deviance is relatively undetected, and it's a type of deviant behavior that we all engage in at some point in our life, and it generally is not regulated, heavily anyway, by society. Secondary deviance, though, is extremely noticeable, and society or an organization is going to focus on these acts. And the process of secondary deviance is that you start with primary deviance, and then you slowly work your way up to secondary deviance. If we think about intercollegiate athletics and how, for example, maybe from the NCAA's point of view, how they try to regulate what is considered good or bad in regards to amateurism or student athletes. Now, labeling theory as an actual theory is relatively simple. And the way that Becker described it is, think of a tag being placed upon someone, and this tag is so powerful that it actually influences or constrains future interactions with that particular person. Deviance, as we know, is caused by a variety of different social factors, and that tag or that label that's been placed on someone influences the repetition of acts of deviant behavior. You know, one thing to consider, as you can see over here from the pictures, you know, when we talk about labels being placed upon individuals and how those labels influence how people act in the future with them, especially from a sport context. One of the things, if you think of the famous, relatively recent example in the National Football League of Tim Tebow. Tim Tebow was a very popular player at the University of Florida, quarterback, a Heisman Trophy winner. He came into the NFL, and because of his religious beliefs, he inspired a lot of excitement and fervor from non-quote-unquote football people. And a lot of football executives in the in the NFL talked about, yes, he wasn't necessarily a great fit for the NFL game in terms of how he passed the ball and all that kind of stuff, but they said really he was a lot of trouble because of all this excitement and all the people that surrounded and were fans of Tim Tebow. That would be another example of labeling theory. This is just kind of a graphic representation of all the different things that go into labeling theory. And so when you think about it, and I tried to use this one because when we talk about deviant behavior, everything really is cyclical. It's not necessarily just with an arrow and it starts here and ends here. The whole idea of the self-concept and how that relates to labeling theory. In addition to the development and enforcement of rules, labeling theory really is going to look at and try to examine the impact that those tags that we talked about that are placed upon the individual, how that tag influences the individual to view themselves. Similar to sort of the hidden curriculum in education, this is a very famous, some very famous studies, but the idea is that if you tell people over and over and over again that they are something, at some point you really start to believe it. So the hidden curriculum in education, there's a famous study where students were divided, and these were young kids, say kindergarten, and they were divided into different groups based on, say, eye color. So if you had blue eyes, you were in one group. If you had brown eyes or green eyes, you were in another group. And they told the people that had blue eyes, for example, that they were the best students, they were very intelligent, they could read well, they could do math well, regardless of what their test score said. And then regardless, for the other group, what their test score said, they said that they were bad students, they didn't behave in class, etc., etc. Well, over time, what they found is that those labels that were placed upon those individuals, the children started to believe it. And it really did become a self-fulfilling prophecy that influences how individuals view themselves, or the self-concept. Self-esteem is another idea. Kind of the global self-esteem is your overall view of yourself. Chambliss in the mid-1970s had a very famous sociological, criminological study talking about the saints and the roughnecks, and how society's view, the saints were the rich kids and the roughnecks were the poorer kids. And even though they were engaged in the same types of deviant behaviors, because the saints had some advantages, such as having cars and things like that, and then how the communities viewed them, those students took on society or that community's view of themselves, and they started to believe that they were definitely saints or that they were roughnecks. And so now, and that particular study really looked at not just self-esteem, not just labeling theory, but also this idea of social class and some of those social advantages or disadvantages and how that influences you as a person. The thing about global self-esteem that's really interesting is that we start trying to understand and take a holistic view of who you are as a person. That's your identity, even though we know that the identity of an individual tends to be multifaceted. A lot of things that we do throughout the day are going to be bits and pieces of who we are. Right now I'm a teacher, but then when I go home I'm a father, I'm a husband. All these different roles that I play. I'm also simultaneously, I'm a son to my parents, those types of things. All these roles that we play throughout the day are part and parcel to who we are. And this is kind of interesting when you start thinking about student athletes. Student athletes in a variety of different educational settings are known primarily as athletes, more so than students. And so if that's how you're treated over and over and over again, and the main emphasis becomes on being eligible for your sport as compared to understanding the material in your courses, then you can start to see, hopefully, how that can influence the self-esteem and the identity of an individual. Some of the things, now, this is just a picture pulled from the internet, and I have no idea if this is real or if it's been photoshopped or whatever, but I liked how sort of polarizing and polemical it was. But the idea that Labeling does have an impact on individuals, and we know it can be very long lasting and very impactful if that label is defined by respected authority figures, maybe a coach, maybe parents or guardians, maybe educational system, etc. We also know that the effects of labeling are going to be greatly magnified if that label or that tag is applied early in life and if it's related to some aspect of deviant behavior. So you are a cheater, or you're someone that's a dirty player, those types of things. And then eventually, if as the process kind of works, that label is believed to be true by the labelee, then we know it can have dramatic, long-lasting impact. For examples, a lot of people have talked about student-athlete services in something like intercollegiate athletics, and a lot of people say, well, it's a very interesting topic because you have student-athletes have individuals that can work with them on their classes, you have study hall, and you have a support network. Well, that's all well and good, and that's supposed to be a positive. A lot of scholars have posited and put forth, though, that as soon as student athletes come into the intercollegiate athlete and higher education environment, because there's so much support, the assumption is that they need it and they're not very good at taking care of the quote-unquote business in the classroom. And so having all of these support services from this particular point of view can have a negative impact on how these student athletes see themselves interacting in their classrooms. Just an interesting way of looking at it. I don't know if it's right or wrong, definitely something to kind of put forth. Another is this whole idea of the weightlifters, and again kind of relating back to the photo here on the slide, is that when you're dealing with people whose entire livelihood is kind of tied up or part and parcel to being physical. And yes, there is strategy in weightlifting. There is a focus on form and maintaining training schedules and things like that. But for a lot of people, it's kind of that mind-body dichotomy where, okay, if you're labeled as someone who only works with their body, and the assumption is that most weightlifters are cheaters, for those that are part of that community in that world, that can be very, very difficult to keep at bay, keep at arm's length. And over time, those labels can really start to erode away at the self-confidence and the self-concept of those individuals, to maybe even to the point that if you're considered being a cheater, someone who takes steroids, other PEDs or PESs and things like that, and you've been doing it clean, but people have been telling you that you're probably dirty, your sport is dirty, over time, maybe you just start to believe it and eventually engage in that behavior. All of this stuff, labeling theories, is a nice way of getting into this discussion. We won't go really, really in depth into this, but the whole idea of stigma. All right, and stigma is very powerful. You know, if you talk about people that are stigmatized, or stigma being a label that's placed upon you to some extent, and people are going to view you a certain way because of it. Well, Irving Goffman in the early to mid 1960s really took this idea of stigma and tried to understand it and really see how that relates to the individuals. And he talked about a couple of different forms of stigma. One is the abnormalities of the body, whether you have physical or mental disabilities, and that's how people are going to know you, and that's how they're going to see you, and they're going to form assumptions based off of those physical or mental disabilities. Another form of stigma that Goffman identified were character blemishes, as he called them. And maybe this was being weak, or if you were dishonest. Oftentimes you're going to be identified through some sort of record or label. Prisoners, if you've spent time and you were incarcerated, and as you try to transition back into sort of the general public, it's very difficult because you're known primarily as someone who is incarcerated, as a convict, an ex-con. It's even difficult to get different types of jobs, whether you're even working in, you know, the fast food service industry or things like that, because that record of you being involved in the criminal justice system is there, and it's very, very stigmatizing, and a lot of people make some assumptions based upon that. And then we also know that there are stigmas of race, religion, nationality, gender, and this might be associated with your family, this might be associated with, you know, where you grew up, those types of things. The thing about stigma that's interesting is it's pretty easy to notice in terms of how Goffman was talking about it. It's also when there's a kind of a stigma label placed upon someone, it tends to be very polarizing, and it's something that sets them apart. It also tends to dramatically influence how a society or community is going to interact with that individual. And lots of times that person that has stigma placed upon them is going to be assumed to be incompetent until proven otherwise. And that's kind of interesting because we're going to come back to this particular point on the very next slide. So how do you combat stigma? One is to engage in traditionally accepted activities, so become part of the norm. Sport participation is a great way to be involved in sort of traditional sanctioned activities. And then the lack of participation, if you do not participate in these traditionally accepted activities, then a lot of people see that as, oh, yep, see, it's reaffirming, it's supporting that stigma that was already there. So when you start thinking about the Paralympic movement and persons that interact in sports that maybe are playing disabled sports and things like that, the assumption, because there is a physical abnormality, is that these individuals are not able to engage in traditional activities. They're going to be quote unquote proven incompetent, or they're going to be considered incompetent until they prove otherwise. So for many individuals, yes, there's the actual love of sport and competition and camaraderie, but also for many persons that have disabilities, they look at ways to be involved in traditional social endeavors. And the Paralympic movement or disabled sports are one way of satisfying that idea that, yes, maybe I don't have the use of my legs. For example, if I'm excuse me, if I'm a paraplegic, I'm involved in some sort of basketball or some sort of wheelchair sport. Maybe I don't have the use of my legs, but I'm still able to do a lot of different things and still compete. There are accommodations made in our sport, yes, but more or less, if you're talking about, for example, when I was at Oklahoma State, this was the wheelchair basketball team at Oklahoma State here in the middle. And so the rules of wheelchair basketball, everything is more or less the same. You have a lot of the same types of things. Instead of 3 seconds in the lane, you had 5 to 7 seconds depending on the level of competition. So you'd have to move your chair in and out of the lane. You did have to dribble. Dribbling had to do with more like 2 rotations of the chair, and then you had to take a dribble and that type of thing. So there were accommodations made to those specific things like chairs, but more or less the game was played and officiated the exact same way. This is a great way of individuals engaging in a traditional, quote-unquote, traditional social activity, that of sport participation. Those that are considered, quote-unquote, different when you're thinking about stigma, those that are stigmatized in society believe that they are normal. Simultaneously, however, they recognize that they are, quote-unquote, different while in the presence of everyone else in that particular community or society. And Adler in the early 1980s did a wonderful ethnographic piece of sociology and deviant research, and it was dealing with Division I men's basketball, and it's called Backboards and Blackboards. And this I thought was kind of interesting because one of the things, some of the themes that came out of it is that even though that this was a very prominent, very high-profile athletic program, a lot of the individuals that participated, the men on this men's basketball team, they felt isolated, separated, and very, very different. The idea is that they were on TV a lot, and everyone in that community, and maybe even to some extent statewide and nationally, knew who they were because they were on TV. But those student athletes did not know who anyone else was. And so they said it was a very weird world, and they felt very different. And there is going to be a stigma that if you engage in high elite level athletics, the idea is that that is your focus and you're not very good at taking care of quote unquote business in the classroom, and that you're not very intelligent. These are some of the stigma and this feeling of difference that they had to interact and defeat at some point to be successful. All of this stuff, when you feel normal but you notice there are differences, whether you want to call that stigma or just abnormalities or just differences in general, that can have a negative impact on individuals and how they view themselves. All right, it's going to increase the shame, and that's going to decrease that global self-esteem of how they feel about themselves. So, at the end of all of this, labeling theory is a useful theory for trying to understand and examine this very unique nature and world of athletics. What I really like about it is it's very easy to apply. Okay, it's almost commonsensical, and there are a lot of different singular elements that you can combine with to talk about the entire theory. If you talk about primary and secondary deviance, or if you just want to take the theory and work with it and trying to understand the impact that sport can have on the individual and within American culture. Now, it's not perfect. And one is that it's hard to prove. For those people that come from social science that really want to prove the reliability and the validity of things, especially through statistics, it's very, very difficult. It's not impossible. It's just because it focuses on the idea of culture and self-esteem and self-concept. All these different things are ideas that are very difficult to capture with numbers. Also, the view that labels create deviant behavior is somewhat oversimplified. Right? It's not that, oh, okay, a label is placed upon someone for no reason and then all of a sudden that person becomes deviant behavior. It's a little bit more nuanced as we start to learn about power, as we start to learn about authority, what is considered right, what is considered wrong, and then those social factors from American culture that really do influence how we look at sports and how we understand sports, and ultimately how we mitigate or define what is deviant or violent within the world of sports.